The muddy water of the Tennessee River had been rising for 3 days straight, and the small town of Millbrook was fighting for its life. Emergency sirens echoed across the valley as National Guard units worked around the clock to reinforce the failing levee system. Among the dozens of soldiers filling and stacking sandbags was Staff Sergeant Rebecca Becker Martinez. Her uniform soaked through and her boots caked with thick river mud. At 32, Becca had seen her share of deployment zones, but this felt different. This was home. She'd grown up just 50 miles from here, and many of the faces she saw behind the emergency shelter windows reminded her of her own neighbors back in her childhood town. "Martinez," shouted Lieutenant Colonel James Peterson from across the work site. "Those bags aren't going to fill themselves. Move it." Becca wiped the sweat from her forehead and hefted another 50-pound sandbag onto the growing wall. She'd been working for 14 hours straight, same as everyone else, but Peterson seemed to take special pleasure in singling her out. Her other soldiers grunted and strained, but none of them caught the same sharp commands she did. "Yes, sir," she called back, her voice steady despite the exhaustion creeping into her bones. Private Danny Collins, a fresh-faced kid from Alabama, stumbled beside her with his sandbag. "How does he expect us to keep this pace?" he muttered under his breath. "My back's about to give out." "You keep going because lives depend on it," Becca replied, not slowing her rhythm. "That family over there in the red house, they've got 3 kids and a grandmother who can't walk. You think they care about your back?" Collins straightened up, chastened by her words but also inspired. That was Becca's way. She led by example, never asking anyone to do something she wouldn't do herself, and always reminding everyone why the mission mattered. But Lieutenant Colonel Peterson saw it differently. As far as he was concerned, Martina was a show-off, always trying to prove she belonged in a man's army. He'd made his feelings clear from the moment she'd been assigned to his unit 6 months ago. Women soldiers were a distraction at best, a liability at worst, and he wasn't about to let political correctness compromise his command. "Martinez," Peterson barked again, striding over with his characteristic swagger. "You're lagging behind. I need you to understand that this isn't some charity volunteer work. This is the National Guard, and we have standards." The work site went quiet around them. Other soldiers pretended to focus on their tasks, but everyone was listening. Peterson had a reputation for these public dressing downs, and Becca was his favorite target. "Sir, I've placed 47 sandbags in the last hour," Becca replied evenly. "That's 3 more than the unit average." Peterson's face reddened. He hated when she had facts to back up her performance. "Don't get smart with me, Sergeant. I don't care about your numbers. I care about attitude and team cohesion. And frankly, your presence here is affecting both." The unfairness of it hit Becca like a physical blow, but she kept her expression neutral. She'd learned long ago that showing emotion would only give Peterson more ammunition. "Understood, sir. I'll continue to do my job to the best of my ability." "See that you do." Peterson started to turn away, then stopped, as if remembering something. "Oh, and Martinez, next time you want to play hero, remember that real soldiers don't need to compensate for anything. They just do the work." The implication was clear, and it stung. Around her, Becca could see some soldiers looking uncomfortable, while others smirked. She'd earned their respect through months of proving herself, but Peterson's constant undermining was taking its toll on unit morale. As the day wore on, the river continued to rise. Weather reports showed more rain coming, and the hastily constructed sandbag barriers were already showing stress. The real test would come with the next wave of flooding, expected to hit around midnight. Becca worked in silence, her mind focused on the task, but also calculating. She'd been in enough crisis situations to recognize when standard procedures wouldn't be enough. The levee system had a weak point about 200 yards downstream. She'd noticed it during her morning reconnaissance. If the water found that weakness, the entire sandbag operation would be worthless. But she also knew that speaking up would only invite more ridicule from Peterson. He'd already made it clear that her tactical observations weren't welcome. She was there to lift heavy objects and follow orders, nothing more. As night fell, the work lights created an eerie glow over the flood zone. The sound of generators mixed with the rush of moving water and the constant radio chatter from the command post. Becca found herself working alongside Sergeant First Class Mike Rodriguez, a career soldier who'd served 3 tours in Afghanistan. "Peterson's got it out for you," Rodriguez said quietly as they positioned another sandbag. "It ain't right." "I can handle it," Becca replied, though she appreciated the support. Rodriguez was one of the few soldiers in the unit who judged people by their actions rather than their gender. "I know you can. That's not the point." Rodriguez paused in his work, glancing toward the command post where Peterson was studying maps with other officers. Thing is, he's so busy trying to put you in your place. He's not seeing the big picture. This levee setup isn't going to hold. Becca heart skipped, so she wasn't the only one who'd noticed the vulnerabilities. The downstream section, you saw it too. Rodriguez nodded grimly. When this thing goes, it's going to take out everything we've built here, plus half the town. Someone needs to tell Peterson, but double quotes, but it won't come from me, Becca finished. She understood the politics. Even if she was right, especially if she was right, Peterson would find a way to twist it into another example of her inability to follow orders and trust her superiors. The night stretched on, each hour bringing more challenges. Equipment broke down in the mud. Soldiers rotated out for brief rest periods, returning exhausted but determined. And through it all, the river kept rising, testing every sandbag, every barrier, every decision that had been made in the frantic rush to protect the town. Becca worked with mechanical precision. Her mind split between the immediate task and the growing certainty that they were building their defenses in the wrong place. She thought about the families sleeping fitfully in the emergency shelter, trusting that the soldiers would keep them safe. She thought about her own family, her parents who'd raised her to stand up for what was right, even when it was difficult. Most of all, she thought about the small metal badge hidden beneath her Gira badge that represented a part of her military service that Peterson knew nothing about. A badge that connected her to missions and capabilities that went far beyond filling. Sandbags in the mud. As the first drops of new rain began to fall, Becca made a decision that would change everything. But for now, she kept working, kept following orders, and waited for the moment when action would matter more than politics. The storm was coming, and with it, a test that would reveal who the real soldiers were. The rain started as a gentle patter, around 10 p.m., but within an hour it had turned into a steady downpour that made every task twice as difficult. The floodlights reflected off the wet surfaces, creating a maze of shadows and glare that made navigation treacherous. Becca's hands were raw from handling the rough sandbags. But she never slowed her pace. Lieutenant Colonel Peterson had retreated to the relative comfort of the command trailer, emerging only to bark orders or critique the work pace. From inside, he could monitor radio communications and coordinate with state emergency management, but he couldn't see what Becca was seeing, the subtle signs that their defensive line was failing. Water was seeping through the sandbag wall at 3 different points. The soil beneath the bags was turning to soup, causing the carefully stacked barriers to shift and settle. Most concerning of all, the water level downstream was rising faster than their models had predicted, putting enormous pressure on the weak section of levee that Becca had identified hours earlier. Rodriguez, she called softly to her work partner. Take a look at Section 7. Rodriguez followed her gaze downstream and cursed under his breath. That's gonna blow any minute. And when it does, all this water is going to find the path of least resistance straight through the middle of town. Becca hefted another sandbag, maintaining the appearance of routine work while her mind raced through options. We need to evacuate the shelter and get those families to higher ground. Peterson won't listen, not from us. Becca knew he was right. She'd tried to raise tactical concerns with Peterson before, only to be shut down and publicly humiliated. But this wasn't about her pride or his prejudices. This was about the lives of 300 civilians, who were counting on them to make the right decisions. She was still weighing her options when Private Collins approached, his young face pale with exhaustion and worry. Sergeant Martinez, my radio's picking up chatter from the weather service. They're saying we might get another 4 inches of rain in the next 2 hours. 4 inches. Becca felt her stomach drop. With the ground already saturated and the river at near record levels, that much additional water would overwhelm their defenses completely. The question wasn't whether the levee would fail, it was when and how many people would die, because they were in the wrong place when it happened. Collins, I need you to do something for me, she said, making her decision. Go to the command trailer and tell Lieutenant Colonel Peterson that I need to speak with him. It's urgent. But Sergeant, he told us. I know what he told us. Do it anyway. Collins nodded and trudged through the mud toward the command trailer. Becca watched him go, knowing that she was about to cross a line that Peterson would never forgive. But some lines were worth crossing. 5 minutes later, Peterson emerged from the trailer, his expression thunderous even in the dim light. Martinez, what the hell do you think you're doing? I gave explicit orders that I wasn't to be disturbed with trivial concerns. Sir, this isn't trivial. Becca straightened to attention, water streaming off her helmet. The downstream levee section is failing. When it goes, it's going to create a flood surge that will overwhelm our sandbag barriers and hit the evacuation shelter directly. Peterson's eyes narrowed. Are you questioning my tactical assessment, Sergeant? Sir, I'm reporting a critical change in field conditions that requires immediate action. The only thing that requires immediate action is your attitude adjustment. Peterson stepped closer, his voice rising enough that nearby soldiers could hear. I am the commanding officer here, Martinez. I make the tactical decisions. Your job is to fill sandbags and follow orders. Is that understood? Around them, work had slowed as soldiers tried to listen without appearing to eavesdrop. This public confrontation was exactly what Becker had hoped to avoid, but Peterson seemed determined to make it a spectacle. Sir, with respect, I have experience in you, have experience in nothing that matters here. Peterson cut her off. What you have is a need to prove yourself that's clouding your judgment. This is exactly why women don't belong in combat roles. Too emotional, too prone to panic. The words hit the worksite like a lightning strike. Several soldiers stopped what they were doing entirely, shocked by the blatant unfairness of the attack. Rodriguez looked like he wanted to intervene, but military protocol tied his hands. Becca felt heat rise in her chest, but she forced her voice to remain steady. Sir, I'm not panicking. I'm trying to save lives. No, Sergeant, you're trying to save face. You've been struggling to keep up all day, and now you want to distract from your poor performance by playing amateur engineer. Peterson's voice carried clearly across the worksite. Well, let me make something clear. I don't care about your opinions, your feelings, or your desperate need for attention. I care about results, and the only result I want from you is completed sandbags. Can you handle that simple task, or do I need to find someone more capable? The silence that followed was broken only by the rain and the distant sound of rushing water. Becca could feel the eyes of 30 soldiers on her, waiting to see how she would respond to this humiliation. Some looked sympathetic, others embarrassed. A few appeared to be enjoying the show. I can handle it, sir, she said finally. Good, then get back to work, and don't waste my time with any more of your theories. Peterson turned on his heel and stalked back to the command trailer, leaving Becca standing in the rain with the taste of injustice bitter in her mouth. The other soldiers slowly resumed their work, but the atmosphere had changed. The confrontation had confirmed what everyone already knew. Peterson had it out for Martinez, and he was willing to be publicly unfair about it. But Becca wasn't thinking about fairness anymore. She was thinking about the families in the shelter, about the children who would drown if the levee failed while everyone was looking in the wrong direction. Peterson had made his position clear. Her tactical input wasn't welcome, regardless of its merit. That left her with only one option, that as the night wore on, Becca continued filling and placing sandbags, but part of her attention was focused downstream. She could see the erosion getting worse, the water finding new ways around their barriers. She estimated they had maybe 2 hours before catastrophic failure. Around midnight, during a shift change, she quietly approached Rodriguez. I need you to cover for me for about 20 minutes. Where are you going? To do something that's going to get me caught. Marshaled. Becca stripped off her work gloves and reached for her gear bag. From inside, she pulled out a waterproof pouch she'd kept carefully hidden. But first, I need to make a phone call. Rodriguez watched as she opened the pouch and retrieved a satellite phone, military grade, with encryption capabilities that went far beyond standard National Guard equipment. Jesus, Martinez, what the hell is that? Becca didn't answer immediately. Instead, she activated the phone and began entering a number from memory, a number that would connect her to people who would listen, people who understood that sometimes following orders wasn't the same as doing your duty. Rodriguez, she said as the call connected, there are some things about my service record that Peterson doesn't know, things that are above his clearance level, and right now, those things are the only hope those families have. The phone clicked, and a voice answered on the other end, professional, alert despite the late hour. Night Operations Center, this is Major Williams. Major, this is Staff Sergeant Rebecca Martinez, Nightshade Unit, serial number 7742986. I need to report a code orange situation. There was a pause, then the voice became more focused. Authentication required, Sergeant. Becca looked around, to make sure no one was listening, then recited a series of numbers and letters that would verify her identity and her authorization to make this call. Code Orange meant civilian lives were in immediate danger due to command failure or incompetence. Authentication confirmed. Go ahead with your report. As Becca began to explain the situation, Rodriguez stared at her with new understanding. The Nightshade unit badge hidden on her gear strap wasn't just some old unit insignia, it was active. current and connected to levels of military authority that a National Guard lieutenant colonel couldn't touch. The game was about to change completely. Major Williams, I have 300 civilians in immediate danger due to tactical mismanagement at the local command level. Becca spoke quietly into the satellite phone, her back turned to the worksite. The commanding officer has refused to acknowledge critical intelligence about levee failure and will not authorize evacuation of the emergency shelter. Understood, Sergeant Martinez. What's your assessment of the timeline? Becca looked downstream at the failing levee section, calculating water flow and erosion patterns based on her training in combat engineering training that Peterson knew nothing about. 90 minutes, maybe less. When it goes, we'll have a 15-foot wall of water moving at approximately 20 miles per hour straight toward the shelter, and the local commander, Lieutenant Colonel James Peterson, National Guard, Becca paused, choosing her words carefully. He's operating under personal biases that are compromising his judgment. I've attempted to brief him on the tactical situation, but he's dismissed my input as emotional overreaction. There was silence on the other end as Major Williams processed this information. The Nightshade unit was an elite disaster response team that operated under Joint Special Operations Command. Its members were embedded in regular military units across the country, maintaining their cover identities while providing a direct line to federal resources when local commanders proved inadequate to handle crisis situations. Sergeant, I'm looking at your personnel file. Your background in combat engineering and flood management makes you the tactical expert on scene. Is that correct? Yes, sir. I've handled 17 major flood operations across 4 deployment zones. I know what failure looks like. Then you're authorized to take whatever action is necessary to protect civilian lives. Backup is en route. Time scrambling a Black Hawk with a federal emergency management team. They'll be on station in 45 minutes. Becca felt relief wash over her. What about Lieutenant Colonel Peterson? Leave Peterson to us. Your job is to keep those civilians alive until help arrives. Use whatever resources you need. Your authority comes directly from JSOC now. Understood. Major Martinez out. Becca ended the call and stowed the satellite phone, her mind already shifting into tactical mode. 45 minutes wasn't much time, but it was enough if she moved fast and smart. The first priority was getting the civilians out of the flood zone. The second was making sure her fellow soldiers weren't caught in the water surge when the levee failed. She turned back toward the worksite to find Rodriguez watching her with a mixture of awe and concern. So that unit badge isn't just for show. No, it's not. Becca grabbed her gear and started walking toward the emergency shelter. I need you to quietly spread the word to the other NCOs. Tell them to start moving equipment and personnel to higher ground. Don't make it obvious Peterson can't know what we're doing until it's too late for him to stop us. What about you? I'm going to evacuate that shelter, with or without official authorization. The emergency shelter was a converted high school gymnasium, packed with families who'd been forced from their homes by the rising water. Red Cross volunteers moved among them, distributing blankets and hot coffee, while local officials tried to project calm authority despite their obvious worry. Becca approached the shelter coordinator, a middle-aged woman named Mrs. Patricia Hendricks, who'd been running disaster relief operations in the county for over a decade. Ma'am, I'm Staff Sergeant Martinez with the National Guard. I need to speak with you privately. Mrs. Hendricks looked up from her clipboard, noting the serious expression on Becca's face. Is there a problem, Sergeant? Yes, ma'am, there is. Becca kept her voice low but urgent. The levee downstream is going to fail within the next hour. When it does, this building is going to be underwater. We need to evacuate everyone immediately. But Lieutenant Colonel Peterson assured us Lieutenant Colonel Peterson is wrong. The words came out harder than Becca intended, but there wasn't time for diplomacy. Ma'am, I'm a federal disaster response specialist. I've seen this exact scenario 17 times, and I know how it ends. We have maybe 30 minutes to get these people to safety. Mrs. Hendricks studied Becca's face, reading the urgency and expertise there. After 30 years of disaster work, she'd learned to trust her instincts about people, and every instinct told her that this young soldier knew what she was talking about. What do you need me to do? Start moving everyone toward the buses. Tell them it's a precautionary relocation to a more comfortable facility. Don't panic them, but don't waste time either. Can you do that? I can. Mrs. Hendricks set down her clipboard and straightened her shoulders. Sergeant, I hope you know what you're doing. So do I, ma'am. As Mrs. Hendricks began quietly organizing the evacuation, Becca stepped outside and keyed her radio. All units. This is Martinez. I need a squad-level meeting at Checkpoint 3. Now. One by one, the squad leaders made their way to her position, leaving their work crews under the supervision of team leaders. Rodriguez arrived first, followed by Sergeant First Class Thompson, Staff Sergeant Kumar, and Sergeant Washington. These were the unit's senior NCOs, experienced soldiers who'd served in combat zones and understood when to follow orders and when to follow their conscience. Listen up, Becca said without preamble. The downstream levee is going to fail in the next 30 minutes. When it does, everything from here to the main road is going to be underwater. We need to get our people out of the flood zone now. What about Peterson? Thompson asked. Peterson's in the command trailer, probably coordinating with state officials who are working with outdated information. By the time he realizes what's happening, it'll be too late. Becca looked at each of them in turn. I'm not asking you to disobey orders. I'm telling you that in 30 minutes, this is going to be a recovery operation instead of a rescue operation if we don't act. The NCOs exchanged glances. They'd all seen Becca's performance over the past 6 months, had watched her handle complex situations with skill and calm professionalism. They'd also seen Peterson's treatment of her, recognized the personal animosity that was clouding his judgment. What do you need us to do? Rodriguez asked. Start moving your squads toward higher ground. Make it look routine equipment maintenance, resupply, run, whatever. Just get them out of the flood zone. Becca checked her watch. And be ready to help with civilian evacuation when the buses get here. Buses? Kumar raised an eyebrow. The shelter coordinator is moving the families now. Federal backup is en route, but we're on our own until they arrive. As the NCOs dispersed to move their soldiers, Becca felt the weight of command settling on her shoulders. She was effectively staging a mutiny against Peterson, using her authority as a Nightshade unit operative to override his decisions. If she was wrong about the levee failure, her military career was over. If she was right, she'd save 300 lives and probably still face court-martial for insubordination. But as she watched the first bus pull up to the shelter and begin loading evacuees, she knew she'd made the right choice. Leadership wasn't about following orders blindly, it was about making the hard decisions when lives hung in the balance. 20 minutes later, the downstream levee failed exactly as she'd predicted, sending a wall of water rushing toward the now empty emergency shelter. By then, the civilians were safe on higher ground, and most of the soldiers had moved to defensive positions that would keep them out of the flood surge. Lieutenant Colonel Peterson, however, was about to have the worst night of his military career. Sound of the levee failing was like thunder, a deep, rumbling crack that seemed to shake the earth itself. From her position on the ridge overlooking the flood zone, Becca watched as thousands of gallons of river water poured through the breach, creating a torrent that swept away everything in its path. The emergency shelter, which had housed 300 civilians just 30 minutes earlier, disappeared under 15 feet of muddy water. The carefully constructed sandbag barriers that Peterson had insisted would hold were scattered like toys. The entire lower section of the worksite was now a raging river. Jesus Christ, whispered Rodriguez, standing beside her. If those families had still been down there, they'd all be dead. Becca finished. Around them, soldiers who'd been quietly moved to safety watched the destruction with a mixture of awe and relief. They understood now why their NCOs had suddenly found reasons to relocate equipment and personnel to higher ground. The sound of helicopter rotors cut through the night air as the federal response team arrived. A Black Hawk helicopter settled onto the makeshift landing zone that Becca had designated, and 6 figures in emergency response gear jumped out. Leading them was a tall man in his 40s wearing the insignia of a full colonel. Colonel James Mitchell strode directly to Becca, his expression serious but not unfriendly. Staff Sergeant Martinez, I'm Colonel Mitchell, JSOC. Emergency response. I understand you've had an interesting evening. Yes, sir. All civilians have been successfully evacuated to the high school on Maple Street. No casualties, no injuries. The local commander, Becca pointed toward the command trailer, which was now sitting on a small island of higher ground, surrounded by floodwater. Lieutenant Colonel Peterson has been coordinating from the mobile command post. Sir, he's unaware of the evacuation. Colonel Mitchell nodded grimly. I see. Well, let's go have a conversation with the lieutenant colonel. The group made their way down to the command trailer, wading through ankle-deep water that was still rising. Peterson emerged as they approached, his face flushed with anger and confusion. What the hell is going on here? He demanded, looking from the federal officers to Becca. Martinez, where are the civilians? Where are my work crews? The civilians have been evacuated to safety, sir, Becker replied formally. The work crews were moved to defensive positions before the levee failure. Levee failure? What levee failure? Peterson looked around wildly, then seemed to notice for the first time that everything below the ridge was underwater. This wasn't supposed to happen, the engineer said. Lieutenant Colonel Peterson, Colonel Mitchell interrupted, his voice carrying the unmistakable authority of Federal Command. I'm Colonel Mitchell, Joint Special Operations Command. I need to speak with you about your handling of this emergency situation. Peterson straightened, trying to regain his composure. Sir, I've been managing this operation according to standard National Guard protocols. Any problems you're seeing are the result of insubordination by certain members of my unit. He glared at Becker. I see. And your assessment of the tactical situation was what? Exactly. The sandbag barriers would hold until morning, when additional resources could be brought in. The evacuation shelter was positioned at a safe distance from the river. My plan was sound. Colonel Mitchell pulled out a waterproof tablet and showed Peterson a series of photographs, aerial shots of the levee system taken just hours earlier. These images clearly show structural failure in the downstream section. The breach we just witnessed was entirely predictable. Did you conduct proper reconnaissance of the levee system? Peterson's face went pale. We relied on local engineering reports. They said the levee was sound. When were those reports filed? I am not sure. Colonel Mitchell handed the tablet to one of his team members and fixed Peterson with a steady stare. Lieutenant Colonel, those reports were filed 18 months ago, before the unusually wet spring season that saturated the soil base and compromised the structural integrity of the entire levee system. A proper tactical assessment would have identified the failure point and prompted immediate evacuation of the danger zone. Sir, I had limited resources and incomplete information. You had Staff Sergeant Martinez. Colonel Mitchell cut him off. According to her service record, she's one of the most experienced flood management specialists in the federal system. She attempted to brief you on the tactical situation, and you dismissed her input. Is that correct? Peterson looked trapped. Glancing between the colonel and Becker, Sergeant Martinez has a tendency to overreact. She's emotional. I made a command decision based on experience and proper military protocol. Emotional. Colonel Mitchell repeated the word like it tasted bad. Lieutenant Colonel, are you aware that Staff Sergeant Martinez holds advanced certifications in combat engineering, disaster hydrology, and emergency evacuation management? Are you aware that she's successfully managed 17 major flood operations, including 3 that involve civilian populations larger than what we had here tonight? I know, sir, that's not in her personnel file. It's not in the personnel file you have access to, Colonel Mitchell corrected. Staff Sergeant Martinez is a member of the Nightshade unit, operating under federal authority for disaster response operations. Her tactical assessment tonight was backed by more relevant experience than your entire unit combined. The words hit Peterson like a physical blow. He looked at Becker with new eyes, seeing not the troublesome female soldier he'd been trying to put in her place, but a federal operative whose authority superseded his own. Sir, I wasn't informed. You weren't informed because Nightshade operatives maintain cover identities in regular units, specifically to provide expert assessment when local commanders prove inadequate. Colonel Mitchell's tone remained professional, but the criticism was unmistakable. Your job was to listen to expert input and make sound tactical decisions. Instead, you allowed personal bias to cloud your judgment, putting civilian lives at risk. Peterson opened his mouth to argue, then closed it again. Around him, his own soldiers were watching the confrontation with expressions ranging from shock to satisfaction. The truth was finally coming out. Furthermore, Colonel Mitchell continued, your public treatment of Staff Sergeant Martinez violated multiple regulations regarding professional conduct and equal treatment of personnel. I have witness statements from your own soldiers documenting patterns of harassment and discrimination. Sir, I never. Lieutenant Colonel, you're relieved of command, effective immediately. You'll be transported to Fort Campbell for a full investigation and possible court-martial proceedings. Colonel Mitchell gestured to 2 of his team members who stepped forward to escort Peterson. As Peterson was led away, he turned back to Becker with a mixture of anger and bewilderment. This isn't over, Martinez. Yes, sir, it is, Becker replied quietly. Colonel Mitchell watched the helicopter lift off with Peterson aboard, then turned back to Becker. Outstanding work tonight, Sergeant. Your actions saved 300 lives and prevented what could have been the worst disaster in this county's history. Thank you, sir. Just doing my job. Your real job, or your cover job, Becker. smiled for the first time in hours. Both said, "They're not as different as people think." Around them, the floodwater continued to rise, but the immediate crisis was over. The families were safe, the soldiers were accounted for, and justice had finally been served. As dawn approached, Becca helped coordinate the recovery operation, working alongside soldiers who now looked at her with the respect and recognition she'd earned but been denied. The reckoning was complete, but the real story was just beginning. 3 weeks later, Becca stood in the conference room at Fort Campbell, wearing her dress uniform with its full array of ribbons and decorations. Decorations that told the story of a career far more distinguished than anyone in Peterson's unit had imagined. Across from her sat a panel of senior officers conducting the final review of the Millbrook incident. Staff Sergeant Martinez, began Brigadier General Patricia Hawkins. "Your actions during the Millbrook flood operation have been thoroughly investigated. The panel finds that your decision to bypass local command authority was not only justified but exemplary. Your tactical assessment was accurate, your response was proportional, and your leadership prevented a catastrophic loss of civilian life. Thank you, ma'am." General Hawkins continued. "However, this incident has raised important questions about the integration of special operations personnel into regular units, and about command structures during crisis situations. The Army is implementing new protocols. Based on your recommendations." Becca's left sat Colonel Mitchell, who had become something of a mentor in the weeks following the flood. "The Nightshade unit program is being expanded," he said. "We're placing more specialists in National Guard and Reserve units, with clearer authority structures to prevent future incidents like what happened with Lieutenant Colonel Peterson." Speaking of Peterson, Becca had learned that his court had resulted in dismissal from service and loss of pension benefits. The investigation had uncovered a pattern of discriminatory behavior toward female soldiers that went back years, with multiple complaints that had been ignored or covered up by his superiors. "Ma'am," Becca said, "what about the soldiers who served under Peterson? They're good people who got caught in a bad situation." "The unit is being restructured under new leadership," General Hawkins replied. "In fact, we'd like you to consider taking command. You'd be promoted to Master Sergeant and given authority to rebuild the unit's culture and capabilities." The offer was tempting, but Becca had already made her decision. "With respect, ma'am, I think my talents are better used in the field, working with units that need specialized expertise, training the next generation of Nightshade operatives." General Hawkins smiled. "I expected you'd say that." "Very well, Sergeant Martinez. You're being transferred to the Nightshade Training Command at Fort Bragg, where you'll develop curriculum for disaster response operations." After the formal proceedings ended, Becca found herself in the base cafeteria with Rodriguez Thompson and several other soldiers from the Millbrook operation. They'd requested permission to attend the hearing, wanting to see justice done for the soldier who'd saved not only civilian lives but their own. "So," Martinez Rodriguez said, raising his coffee cup in a mock toast, "turns out you really were the expert in the room." "I tried to tell you guys," Becca replied with a grin, "but nobody listens to the troublemaker with emotional problems." The group laughed, but Thompson's expression grew serious. "You know, what Peterson did to you that was wrong from day one. We all knew it, but we didn't speak up. That's on us." "No," Becca said firmly, "that's on Peterson. You guys had your own careers to worry about, your own families to feed. I never expected you to sacrifice that for me." "Maybe not, but things are going to be different from now on," said Sergeant Washington, one of the younger NCOs. "This whole thing taught us something about standing up for what's right, even when it's difficult." Rodriguez nodded. "The new commander, Lieutenant Colonel Sarah Williams, she's been briefing us on the new protocols. Any soldier who reports discrimination or harassment gets full protection. No more of this handle it internally nonsense." As the group talked, Becca reflected on the strange turns her life had taken. 6 months ago, she'd been just another soldier trying to prove herself in a hostile environment. Tonight she was heading to one of the Army's most